India should commit towards engaging or making trade, making education, particularly higher education, as a tradable service. But as of now, on record, hitherto, India has not made any much such commitments. But this round that is happening in today's context is where these issues have been very importantly raised upon. And secondly, I thought I'd also lay back some kind of impression and examination about how this 1986 becomes an important period in the entire history of higher education system that evolves. Because in 86, technically or symbolically, we moved towards what we were then as Minister of Education to Minister of Human Resource Development. And I think that nomenclature also informs us something critical about how education, particularly higher education, was relevant and significant and how they conceptualize it in terms of policy making and its implications on the ground. Then later on, I would like to develop some focus on, but as a part of discussion, Dr. Rajan Gurukul will focus on it as you, brother. In terms of this whole notion of privatization of higher education, this is one important dimension which has also evolved over time. That's where commodification is much more critically observed towards. And also, very interestingly, Anil Sarkopal had very interesting observations about this autonomous colleges and how this autonomy should be deconstructed. Autonomy is just on the face of it or in terms of its policy implication could be as in simple sense that how it could enable quality in education by having autonomy within the colleges or universities in terms of research, etc., teaching and services that they conduct on what we call functions of the higher education institutions. But this autonomy is not just that, because autonomy here also means eventually they become self-financed, eventually become self-driven, eventually becomes much more privatized also, because that also provides the space to autonomous colleges. And I think some of them already see, at least in Bangalore we have seen one good example is Christ University, particularly how it has evolved over time from affiliated college to autonomous college to a private deemed university today, and how it is having certain policies which are problematic in terms of making education as or where students are seen as more consumers or customers. And then the other important point is I think the UGC Occupy issue that we have already been seeing it on media, that how it is also inherently or embedded in the overall practices of eventual acts of GATS and WTO's interventions in making higher education services. One could link it. As of now, I don't have evidence and empirical facts to share that, but I have a thought that we could link that as an argument, or arguably we could see that there's a link between this protest and also the concern that students are raising out there in Delhi, particularly students from Central University. Then finally, I would also, this whole discussion of why I am here is also because recently we concluded a study on internationalization of higher education or in higher education, where again there was a study about two types of institutions, a private university and a public university. And then what we found that the overall processes of internationalization or agenda of internationalization among the private universities or in that particular private university was really vigorous and really embedded into their overall practices of the university. And if you see just the comparison in terms of quantity, numbers of students and also the quantity in terms of their financial outcomes, I thought the public university was quite low in its interaction or quite less in enabling interaction with data, but private university was very vigorously engaging in it. But what makes that private university to be such with such vigor entering into this act of internationalization? That's a big question to explore. So this, and then now getting into the major part of my discussion that I wanted to highlight was in terms of what is that all about we're talking about in the context of GATS and WTO, and where do we look at higher education? That's the most important thing. I will explore more, then come back to the questions in the other outline that I quickly mentioned earlier. So there is this article 29 in the WTO agreements which states, and I would like to quote so that it becomes for us to discuss further. WTO members shall enter into successive rounds of negotiation to achieve a progressively higher level of liberalization. That's the larger objective under which GATS and WTO operates particularly. And now how we look at higher education or education in this, right? GATS generally encompasses, right, all the service industries which lay out in the member countries, but there are two exemptions. That's why it becomes interesting to explore further and critical. The two exemptions are services provided in the exercise of governmental authority and with regard to air traffic control. These two exemptions are made in WTO, where this service industries are where commitments are not made by nation states. They are kept within the nation states and it's not being part of the WTO negotiations. But our concern here is the first part, that is the part of services provided with the exercise of governmental authority. That's, in other words, could be located as public education or where government intervenes or state intervenes in provision of education. And now with this commitment if we make, because this is where the government is or the nation states or member states are exempted to come into or make certain kind of commitments. But now if we privatize education where the government takes a back step and then where the state rolls back with technical parlance, then what will enable this kind of space where commitments will be made by member states and how those commitments will impact the overall processes of the education system. So further, the Article 1.3 of GATS, I would like to quote them because they are useful to make some kind of discourse analysis in itself. That's why I am using those terminologies. Article 1.3 of the GATS suggests that certain governmentally or processes or act services supplied by government services are defined as, I'm quoting them, any service which is supplied neither on a commercial basis nor in competition with one or more service suppliers within the member states. So private higher education being heavily subsidized and public universities were seeking private funding, for example, which is the case also to some extent, particularly in the US. This is where the debate of this commitment towards private higher education or commitment through private higher education, where the changes in policy takes place, becomes quite complicated. So this debate about, on one hand, government funding or government-led service provision and the air traffic control, which are very much out of this set of commitments. But as of now, education, particularly higher education, generally or in the larger parlance, we have seen both actors, that is public and private, who are being part and process of that overall activity today. But what becomes much more crucial in the context of this definition of tertiary education services becoming more and more critical is a consultation paper which was put forth by the Ministry of Commerce as a background paper for this particular deliberation, which is ongoing, and also which was put forth in terms of the explanation that they provide, that why we should engage, that is India should make the commitment in WTO in order to make education as a critical service. It's very interesting the way they try to situate. In fact, they build an argument around a reference to the decline in public funding and the stress and the concern that public funding towards higher education or the overall contribution of GDP towards higher education has been declining over time. So we need to look for alternatives. I think that alternative is quite evident, that is towards private funding. That's one particular aspect in which they build this background paper. Secondly, they also develop an argument that the global market for export of education and also they look at case studies of US, Australia, Finland, Sweden and others, and see that how they are able to, in fact some of the ASEAN countries also, particularly Singapore and Malaysia, and how are they able to enable some kind of excellence in higher education, some kind of facility in terms of access to higher education to majority through such kind of alternative mechanisms which they refer to as the access to market or private funding, where the public sector is declining and it will continue to decline over time. And they are building up a particular justification to this commitment that they envision that the government or the country will make in the WTO negotiations. Further, they also very interestingly refer to Professor Tilak, who is also one of the well-known scholars in the field of higher education in one of the known institutions which works on education, that is National University of Education, Planning and Administration, in order to substantiate their claim. I'm quoting Tilak here, which is quite interesting. That is, public subsidization of higher education benefits the rich, particularly in elite higher education systems in India. Public subsidization of higher education benefits the rich. And now the question is that how does it benefit? Because the way they have analyzed that report, where they have developed the report is, I think, selectively qualifying some of the literature which enables their claim that yes, we need to go towards alternative source of funding, and that is where the market or the private or in other words invisible hands which could enable that kind of support. And further, they also develop that they provide a potential support or an alternative further to that kind of private funding, is that since this huge amount cannot be, that is amount in terms of of access of students or access for students, which is growing. The demand is growing. So they need to be supplied, and supply they see it in private sector particularly. And further, they say that since it has a lot of pressure on the public exchequer, that is the GDP that we talked about, for example, a mix of following steps would seem to be necessary according to the background paper. That is, first, increasing seats in government colleges and universities in a phased manner. Second, allowing the institutions to raise their own resources. And finally, provide a more liberal regime for private and foreign education providers. This is what I refer to as systematic and systemic. I think that is where, for example, of course there are many references one could make. Like I said, way back from 1986 to 2014, one could see the policy perspectives to it. That is where it is located in the system, organized in such a way that systematically it is organized so that they can lead to this commitment that they are trying to envision in this particular rounds of WTO and GATS. So now the question is that how can we locate this commodification of education in this particular context? That is where the government or the state is trying to develop this kind of an argumentation by building in certain kind of inherent legitimacy to the claim they are making towards a larger commitment they are trying to envision in that WTO GATS regime as of now, on one hand. And second, what have been the larger concerns of the higher education system at the local level or at the micro level as of now, right? Because we have seen that very much that issues of access are still continuing, issues of the quality of education is also considered problem in addition to the funding part. But further, if you also quickly refer to some of the documents of, say, Birla Ambani report, for example, on higher education, just want to go back to India now, which also is another example of a reference that could be made in order to further indicate or suggest the way forward. That is, way forward in terms of making such kind of commitments to make education a tradable service or liberalize education, where the other set of investment we just talked about could come in and engage in such kind of an act which they believe will be good because of the problems which I just mentioned. For example, the pressure on the public exchequer, for example, and many other issues they try to develop around it. But for example, the Birla Ambani report also is interesting because they treat education or education sector as more of an industry which has highest return, and they have certain figures quoted around that. But the concern here is that how do they refer to education as? And I think education as an important investment is one part of it. And now how do they qualify the teacher and the student and the university as? Here the teacher becomes a service provider, if you do a critical analysis of that, and how this student becomes a customer or a consumer, and how the institution becomes a company or an enterprise, and how the entire teaching and learning process becomes not anything but what you call learning for profit making kind of thing in terms of the outcome. That is, whether profit for that individual in terms of the gains that he or she looks into as an outcome of their education, or the overall returns that they seek for the institution per se and enterprise. So I think overall one could locate that the two parts of the story is that one, the issues at the local or the national level is one thing, but taking these issues at the local and national level to the international organizations like WTO, GATS, and then trying to legitimize to some extent or make commitment there to some extent of making the education system here more liberalized and providing way and access to other aspects like market, for example, or private sector becomes a concern. And I think this is where that whole education dimension becomes crucial, because initially, as I said, education was more public good, where public good meaning where it is accessible to all kind of thing. But here when we make it much more as a private good or goods which are more commodified in terms of services, then it becomes limited to a lot of them who are aspiring to get access to that. But I think the problem here is that, yes, this is one thing that we could look at, that national policies evolve over time based on national situations and conditions. But national policies being influenced and altered or to be altered from external influences which are located out there through this kind of commercialization, through this kind of liberalization is something of major concern. In addition to other issues that I just mentioned about that alternatives they tend to propose for in terms of how they look towards addressing this problem. And before I conclude, quickly I would like to map the 4 modes through which this supply of tradable service for education has been envisioned in the WTO or GATT setup, which again many of you might reflect on your own experiences if you're already part of such kind of an experience in terms of the and maybe discuss more on that part. There are 4 modes of supply which once the commitment, if it is made, there are 4 modes of supply which the GATS and the WTO tend to agree upon, and these are all coming from the Uruguay round discussions which were spanning from 1985 onwards up to 2001. So this kind of modes which were discussed. So what are those modes? Mode number 1, they qualify it as cross-border supply. Right? What it does entail? Cross-border supply could entail of education, entails distance delivery or e-education or virtual universities as an example of this mode 1. Mode 2 is more to do with the consumption abroad, in the sense in terms of students studying in another country. That's another mode of supply of this commitment of this liberalization of this tradable service like higher education. The third mode is about setting up branches of a university abroad, and university from abroad setting up branches here, either of the ways, or what we call satellite campuses or franchises, or the most common thing which happens in many of the universities in India today. I think mode 3 has been the most popular of the acts, which is the twinning program, where students exchange from one university to another university for 1 semester or 2 semesters, but for short term exchanges, and also kind of affiliations they tend to develop more and with regard to student exchanges. And the mode 4 has the most problematic mode, that is the mode which is to do with the presence of natural persons in abroad or in the country from one country to another. That is teachers traveling to foreign country to teach into other nation states in terms of what we see in terms of exchanges. But there are short term. This is something which is long term kind of an initiative. So in this set of documentation of all the 4 modes, one could see that 2 set of arguments that one could reflect upon, and more we can add in the discussion. One is the modes itself. Already couple of modes which I mentioned, for example, mode 2, students studying abroad, and mode 3, setting up branch campuses, are very much a practice which is already there in many of the universities in Indian context, but in terms of the actual practice. But mode 1 and mode 4 have been lesser in terms of its focus in the practices. Irrespective of the commitment is made or no in the WTO or GATS negotiation, these practices are already there. But the question is, where are they located? Are they located more in the private university setup, or are they located more in the public university setups, or universities where education is treated as not as a commodity but as actually a public good? So where do we locate these practices more in terms of today's practices? And how can we see that in future, if the commitment is made, which kind or types of universities that we see today? There are 6 to 7 types of universities in India today. So where do we locate in the future commitments, or whether these commitments which are made are going to facilitate a certain kind of or certain type of university, and we will have a concern in terms of access, concern in terms of locating the larger aspirants into that particular types of university. And second important point to reflect on this, which I thought was useful to reflect upon, is that there are certain barriers for each of the modes, which the WTO already suggests. There are certain barriers, and those barriers are located into the national or nation's education system, that is the policies or regulatory mechanisms, etc. And now with those, in order to engage in those modes based on the commitment that nation states made in terms of if India makes, as I said, as of now there is no commitment as against many nation states who have already made commitment, like Australia, Japan, Singapore, Malaysia. They have made commitments. And the nation states who make commitment for all the 4 modes, and the nation states will make commitments for 1 or 2 modes, particularly depending on their negotiation they tend to make on that table where they discuss about these things. But concern here is that now how these barriers are negotiated at the national level. That's where the concern is. I think we can locate those negotiation of those barriers, for example, in the issues which the UGC Occupy protests brings up. For example, withdrawing state support or state funding to students, particularly of Central University particularly. And if this continues, as for example, as a mode, then invariably or inevitably they are trying to accommodate to that commitment they are going to make out there in WTO negotiation in terms of the development of overcoming those barriers. So what we have to see now is that what are those regulatory mechanisms which they are going to bring in, and what are those negotiations that they are going to make with the existing policy discourses, and how are they going to affect the overall process of education being the private good as well as the public good, which was traditionally the case, and it is changing over time to become more private good. So I think these modes tell us some interesting insights, provided some interesting insights to explore what is the way forward that we are going to look into towards the larger privatization or commercialization of education, particularly higher education, where we see on one hand there's expectation of returns, but those returns ought to be for that individual who gets access to, but not returns in terms of profit making, which for example, the Birla Murray report talks about. What is the larger return or ROI, return on investment, that one seeks from this kind of access to education. So I think I don't want to take much time on this part, but I think there will be a lot of questions in discussion. But if you have any specific questions on WPO and GATS report, I'm happy to share some examples from other nation states where they have engaged in such kind of an act, and that has created a lot of issues for them at the local level, at the nation level. For example, as I said, many of the ASEAN countries are now more or less accommodated themselves or accommodated their own national systems towards the commitment they have made to the GATS and the WTO in order to substantiate what we call the equalization of education. So I look forward to discussion, and if you have any questions, I will discuss.
Capitalism. All of you know that is the dominant economy, and the economy decides the functions at the level of every facet. So it's important to define the economy first and then go into the details affecting the country. Now, the knowledge related capitalist phase is known today as techno-capitalism because it depends heavily on technology and science. It is commoditizing new knowledge in technology and science. It is considering new knowledge as the most profitable item in the trade, in the global trade. It is so important that 4/5 of the total global turnover come from new knowledge. Education trade was only a marginal thing. That was only a ground preparation process. When India signed the GATS in 2005, the first requirement was to prepare the domestic market environment conducive to trade in education. And naturally that involved privatization as part of that commercialization. But the actual interest is to divert the whole economy to the domain of production of new knowledge. When we in the academic field talk about new knowledge, we mean the latest knowledge in the area of specialization principles. But the global economy considers marketable knowledge as new knowledge. Knowledge which can immediately become a commodity, and also it can act as a catalyzing power for diversifying knowledge. To illustrate this, if a scientist discovers a new molecule, it's adding value to discovery science. But that alone will not do in knowledge economy. What techno-capitalism wants is conversion of this discovery science into invention science. That is, it's not just publishing the discovery of molecule with its traits, features and dynamic, but it's important to know how this new molecule can be a raw material for the pharmaceutical industry. When the new molecule is converted into a drug, then it becomes another commodity. First, the discovery itself is a commodity, you can exchange it. It's in the context of exchange of knowledge, transference of knowledge for money, intellectual property rights and patents are important. Their knowledge itself is a commodity and it is transferred. But the price of the commodity, price of new knowledge as commodity will be determined by the demand scenario related. And the new knowledge becomes important when the new knowledge is capable of generating multiple commodities. That's how it becomes valuable in the market. And that's the reasons why these days when a discovery science paper is sent a high impact factor journal will write back to the author to wait, because we have to subject this to a consultation process to see how this discovery can be transformed into an invention. That will enhance your H index. The author is encouraged by saying your H index will go up and our impact factor will also go up. Therefore, let us wait. And then the discovery science is left to a team of engineers, and then they convert the discovery science into invention science, and then it's published. This is the process of transforming knowledge into commodity and also capital, because it can generate more commodities. According to GATT's agreement, every member country has to commit to open up the domestic market of knowledge trade for global competitors. That's a commitment, that's a national commitment. The interesting thing is that when the document was signed, about 88%, Sarah has to be, 88% of the total population had no idea about the implication. And interestingly, even the Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, who signed it, had practically no idea. This is how politicians are bamboozled in documents of global interest. This is the case with most countries. The heads of state signed the document without understanding the implication. And people who are expected to study are bureaucrats, and they are very easily persuaded through incentives. So bureaucrats would persuade the heads of states, and that happened precisely in the case of India. After 2005, nation had legally agreed to consider education as an industry, and activities in the industry naturally would be profitable. We had already committed to it, but we come to know about each dangerous facet little by little, and now we are making a given price suddenly as if something strange has happened. It has already become obsolete. Nation has already agreed. In the global legal context, we have already committed, and then going back would involve infringement of internationally agreed rules. Therefore, just as the document got signed by the nation to a trick played by WTO or the capitalist agency through bureaucrats, now the acceptance of, that is the second part of the document. The second part of the GATS document is assertion of national commitment to open up domestic market for foreigners to participate. Even inviting foreign participants in domestic market of knowledge exchange. That is the commitment. Suddenly when the commitment was publicized, and then when he heard that in the Nairobi it's going to be finalized and so on, many people have become alert. But it's too late. Anyway, now the new education policy is in the making. Our institute also got a communication. Part of it's about goal of democratizing the procedures. New education policy is being drafted by the people of India, from the grassroots to the top. That is the rhetoric of it. But the real is, it has already been drafted. And we got item 20 for discussion in Indian Institute of Science. All premier institutions were. Now the state universities was taken into it, because these are not even treated as education institutions. Premier institutions like Indian Institute of Science, IIT, IIMs and so on, they are all consulted. They are all consulted with this single item called the new knowledge. That is number 20 in the draft document. And to various modes, MHRD has collected a vast fund of comments. And we also had a full day workshop, and we prepared a document very sincerely, and we have sent it. Now MHRD has constituted the drafting committee. You know, the drafting committee is headed by the notorious T.S.R. Subramanian, who has become notorious for the High Power Committee on Environment. He is a retired cabinet secretary, and he wrote the report for the High Power Committee of Environment, recommending nullification of some 7 vital acts. I am not going into detail, because that's not our concern. I just wanted to know the stature of T.S.R. Subramanian. In 3 months, he drafted a report amounting to consequences of that time, and also a person having no knowledge about any of these areas. And all these areas are profoundly enunciated areas of higher level specialization. And for a senior IAS officer, specialization is nothing. They are jacks of all trades. They know anything under the sun. And they have no hesitation to write a report exactly as the power groups behind the government constitute. That's what they do. And that's precisely why bureaucrats are always depended upon by the global agencies, global capitals, corporate houses. T.S.R. Subramanian Committee has 3 more retired IAS officers. One is Mrs. Chandra, Shailaja Chandra, retired Chief Secretary of Delhi. Then one S. Sharma, a retired Home Secretary of Delhi, and one retired Chief Secretary, Mankat of Gujarat, retired Chief Secretary, Gujarat. The only academic is another notorious fellow, Rajput, who was the Secretary of NCRT during the period of textbook controversy, the old Janata Dol. At that time, their interest was recasting the entire NCRT books. And the problem that they found was most of the books, particularly books in social sciences, were corrupt by Marxism. Marxism was injected into all the lessons. History was taught as socio-economic history. History should be taught as itihas. That should be. History should be entertaining to students. And therefore they wanted to. And anyway, nationwide resistance was there, and this fellow had become notorious. This is the committee which is going to sit on judgment. Appraising the recommendations made by premier institutions. What do these fellows know about it? For example, recommendations made by a premier institution like Indian Institute of Science. There are so many departments, technology departments and pure science departments, and they all participated in drafting the report. And this report has gone. What does T.S.R. Subramaniam understand out of this? Or which department's recommendation would be intelligible to him? It's very clearly showing that it is just a mockery of the democratic practice. The idea is not to seriously scrutinize and constitute error. It's all just a farce. The draft is already ready as construed by the corporate houses. Now I will go to the last part of my thing. The draft report is asking premier institutions in the country to participate effectively in knowledge trade by generating marketable new knowledge. That's the cause. And what is marketable knowledge is already set by the corporate mega instrumentalist establishments. Now, corporates themselves are running big research establishments. To cite one example, the mega research establishment run by Grupo has 10,000 young science tech researchers working. Some 5,000 pure science people and 5,000 technologists. All of them work with computer. Each one will develop a small module without knowing the larger context. Each one is expected to develop a module in high power computing. And so it started functioning heavily in 2013, and now it has already acquired 2,800 new products, which they call new knowledge items, out of which they have already got 1,550 new US patents, and another lot, 2,200 products seeking patents are in the pipeline. And none of these patents will have anything to do with the young minds work behind in terms of intellectual property rights. Out of these 10,000 youngsters, 5,000 scientists and 5,000 engineers, none of them will have any right over the products. Patent is taken by the court. This is the process of confiscating creativity or innovativeness from youngsters. How? By converting them just as a mechanical component in the mega system. In the mega system, each individual is working out only a small module, and in the larger hypercomputing scenario, these people are mere robots. You find conversion of youth into robots. The only difference is these are eating, drinking, sleeping, reproducing robots. That is the only difference. Otherwise, they are totally apathetic, apolitical, and people having no knowledge about what is at work in their own establishment. And these mega instrumentalist setup, these mega experimentalist organizations have opened up several science-tech hybrid areas of research, which even a premier institution like Indian Institute of Science cannot take up, compete at the world level, and reach any. We are actually nowhere. Even our most excellent institutions are nowhere in such areas. So, for example, high power computing, theoretical research, advanced bioengineered molecular processes, or nanotech sensors and transmitters. You check with the nanoscience, nanotechnology department of this institute and find out their position in the global multinational corporation research domain. We are nowhere. And there are interesting other areas. For example, functional genomics. Functional genomics based on automated methods and microarray technologies for fixing, for determining the gene structure and gene expression, or use of X-ray crystallography or robotic crystallization procedures determining gene structure. This is structural genomics. Examine what is our status in functional genomics and structural genomics. Where are we? How many patents are there? And what is our rating in terms of intellectual property rights? If a premier institution states this, what to talk about other universities? What to talk about the state universities? At the same time, nationally there is this problem. You have to generate marketable knowledge and enable the nation to effectively participate in the global trade of knowledge. What are you going to do? The new education policy's interest is, first you call and then make each institution feel that we are moving. And that way, justifying the pitiable position of each institution just to justify for the reduction in the grant. It's the same technique which early imperialism tried in all the colonies. First, convince the colony people their colonizability. That's it. Each one agrees that no, we were not developed, we were superstitious, we were this, we were that. And British people justified their colonizers. And it was a civilizing mission for them. A big project. Same is it's neo-imperialism using the same strategy but in a different way. In the domain of education, people in developing countries, underdeveloped countries are not taken into account at all. People in developing countries are made to believe that we are nowhere in the domain of research, but we have some young people. All that we can do is we can train the brilliant ones. Through national competition, you select them and then enroll them in an Institute of Science or various IITs and then export. Because here young students will get better laboratory skills and theoretical base and they are equipped to work in a foreign laboratory. You cannot make them produce new knowledge here. You can only export them. Almost like raw materials. They are speaking, eating, reproducing robots. But before they start reproduction, they are sent abroad. That's the only difference. Now, you just think about the new areas which come, the hybrid areas. The new education policy draft document sent to us very clearly indicated that there should be areas of convergence for technology and science. That is science tech. So biosynthetic engineering, robotics, various areas are there like bioinformatics, mimetics, robotics, biopharmacology, agrobiotech, etc. And the policy will beautifully justify disproportionate allocation of the public revenue set apart for educational development. Only promising institutions, the institutions capable of exporting good youngsters for global level knowledge production. Such institutions alone will have better grants. And WTO in the meeting would decide which should be the institution for a country to promote by heavily investing its revenue. Let us hope that Indian Institute of Science will get a good share because this institution will be capable of exporting gas. But at the global level, this institution is nowhere. Its ranking was somewhere around 147 7 months ago. But now it is not even within 200 globally. Another interesting suggestion in the draft report is, now how do we sustain our position in the global ranking of soft power? Soft power is power to assiduously persuade, that is, instead of terrorizing anybody, you smile, persuade. These are soft methods. It's not with any militant power. And various other features are there. Yoga is a soft power for India. You cannot drive science and technology to your beyond a point. We have tried with our capabilities, and we haven't found anything mysterious about yoga. But it is very easy to mystify it and then acquire symbolic capital through that. And even in that kind of an activity, India's position is only 23rd at the global level ranking. And without knowing our actual rank, MHRD drafted the document saying that how do we sustain our status? How do we sustain our 23rd ranking? That's what the document is asking. I quickly wind up coming to the consequence. If this is going to be the trust. Now, the field where we will be able to do something, sustainable research in the domain of local issues, local environmental issues, local personal non-degradable waste, and various factors relating to rising entropy, the problem of climate change, etc. There are various such issues having macro level implications, and there are many micro level equity oriented issues. They are social issues, and we haven't been able to divert the inquisitiveness and analytical faculty of our youngsters to local issues. And our allocation has always been abysmally poor. Now it's going to be zero. Think about the situation. And local questions, agriculture without poison, or how to sustain agrobiology, or how do we solve our drinking water problem. There is much to be researched about sustainable water management. Water is a contested natural resource, and you have from the micro to the global level water-related conflicts. Now, how do we evolve sustainable water storage systems? It becomes necessary to study anthropology of water management, archaeology of water management, because it is important to draw insights from sustainable community techniques of water management in the past. So, without any use of energy, how did they cascade the natural water sources? And from the upper reaches, how did they facilitate distribution of water without any consumption of energy? Various things are. Now we have reached a stage where we do not know that in a city like Bangalore, how after the 137 important water bodies, 88% of them were cascaded, naturally cascaded. And in a soil condition of low permeability, it's a wonderful system if you maintain the cascaded structure of water bodies. We have to study such issues and then prepare implementation packages and so on, having no insights in this. Now, we did the wrong thing that as the lower reach tank happened to be, reservoir happened to be a very big one, we expended a lot of money cleansing it, making it contamination free, this, that, and so on. Then, after one monsoon season, they found it got contaminated again. Then only our civil engineers were able to understand that still there is interconnection existing between the reservoirs in the upper reaches and the this is just one instance in the domain of sustainable technology and sustainable science. We have many things to do and they are not very expensive. But how many of our institutions will be able to take a research in high field NMR technology based protein structure determination research? We will not be able to do that. How many of our universities have HRTD, high resolution electron microscope? How many of our institutions have? But there is another interesting kind of trade which is encouraging purchase of all kinds of such expensive instruments. None of our principal investigators was actually clear about the agenda behind. Allotment of something like 60 to 75% of the total outlay for instrumentation. And the principal investigator himself was a person who doesn't know how to use all these sophisticated instruments for research, but they are allowed to purchase. And I know, from my experience as Vice Chancellor of the State University, the Mahatma Gandhi University in Kerala has something like 60% of its instrumentation unused. It's not underused, unused. University doesn't know how to keep them intact. And many of them have gone waste. Because bureaucracy will decide whether university has money to prepare air conditioning facility for installing the instrument. No money. With the result, a very expensive instrument is not installed properly. You require an air conditioned room. Air conditioning, no money. And this is how a state university is managing its instrumentation. And a major project from DST came for starting inter-university centers of instrumentation. People never realized that it was part of the global trade in advanced instrumentation. And nations are encouraged to import instruments without competent people, without people with laboratory skills to use them. And I know that I haven't studied, but I am guessing that at least 40% of the heavily funded DST projects might not have used the most priced instruments purchased through the allocation. If you make a very serious auditing, you will find this ponderous paradox. How is this happening? This is actually happening because of the push and pull of the global economy, global trading interests. They decide what should be taken. But so far, we had a democratic space. We were able to debate and we were able to influence the policy makers. Now it has become impossible. Now, how will you debate when the decision-making committee has just a joker-like academic who doesn't understand the academic values and passions? All others are retired bureaucrats. And they will decide. They will decide only the draft given to them. They will worsen even linguistically the draft. These people will not be able to draft properly. It will not even have linguistic writing. That's going to be the document. Bureaucratic language doesn't require embellishments of aesthetic value. They require only orders. These are just utterances of imperatives. And that happens. Pity is that even though we do not have a proper, powerful platform for debate in the country, now we can just try, if we have many scientists and technologists self-consciously realist and critical about actual process. We do not have even 12% of politicized scientists and technologists in the country. Now, politicization is something shameful for most of the scientists. I am not a believer in politics. I think many scientists don't fight shy in making such statements. If a specialist doesn't know how the specialization is related to politics, politics means the social use of it, the social significance. It's not party politics. Politics of knowledge should be clear to a scientist, should be clear to a technologist, because it is like the chemical property of salt to salt. If salt is bereft of its chemical properties, saltishness, what is the use of it? It is the same condition. Scientists and technologists are not able to understand the epistemological link between their specializations and the political process. Then they will not be able to do it. They will be able to put up only soft kind of bargain for better funding. And that kind of research used to be considered valuable until the past decade, but now that has ceased. There will not be pure science research anymore. There will not be funding for research for the sake of research, or production of science for the sake of science, production of new knowledge for the sake of new knowledge. Now, it's going to be very, very clear. There will be production of knowledge that has market value, new knowledge which is strikingly new in the context of exchange. What is its value in terms of intellectual property rights,